In the spring of 1919, the air in Boston's North End hung thick with the pungent scent of molasses and yeast, a harbinger of the chaos that would soon envelop the city. The Purity Distilling Company, a relatively new player in the bustling landscape of industrial alcohol production, had expanded its operations in response to the voracious appetite for spirits that Prohibition had ignited. The factory, a formidable brick structure with towering smokestacks belching black smoke, stood as a testament to both ambition and desperation. Inside, the ceaseless clatter of machinery drowned out the distant murmur of the waterfront. Workers, clad in threadbare shirts and caps, moved with a frenetic energy, pouring, mixing, and bottling the thick liquid that would soon be illicitly consumed in speakeasies and backroom bars. The rhythmic thud of barrels rolling across the wooden floors reverberated through the building, a constant reminder of the profits that awaited those who could navigate the treacherous waters of the law. Yet, as the sun rose each day, casting a pale light through the grimy windows, so too did the risks grow. The company's founders, lured by the promise of wealth, had skimped on safety measures in their haste to meet the burgeoning demand. Rumors swirled through the streets, whispered among the dock workers and shopkeepers, of the dangers lurking within the distillery's walls. The proximity of the bustling neighborhood, with its narrow alleys and crowded tenements, only intensified the unease. On the fateful day of January 15, 1919, the factory hummed with activity, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. A worker named Tommy Sullivan, a wiry Dan with a quick smile and nimble fingers, was tasked with overseeing the fermentation tanks, a job he had taken on with pride. Sweat dripped from his brow as he adjusted the valves, the air hot and damp from the bubbling concoctions. He knew the dangers of the volatile mixture, but found himself entranced by the prospect of a brighter future that lay beyond the factory gates. As the clock struck noon, a low rumble reverberated through the building. A sound akin to distant thunder. The workers paused, exchanging uneasy glances, but the noise faded, swallowed by the din of machinery. It was a fleeting moment of foreboding, soon dismissed as the normal creaks and groans of an aging structure. Minutes ticked by, and then, without warning, the air was pierced by a deafening crack. The ground trembled violently as a massive tank, overfilled and underregulated, burst under the pressure of its contents. Molasses erupted like an angry geyser, spraying scalding liquid across the factory floor. Chaos ensued as workers scrambled to escape the torrent, their cries of alarm drowned by the roar of the unleashed tide. Outside, the once bustling streets transformed into a scene of pandemonium. Thick, dark syrup surged into the alleys, engulfing storefronts and sweeping away everything in its path. The North End, so accustomed to the rhythm of life, now found itself swallowed in a viscous wave that rendered the familiar unrecognizable. As the disaster unfolded, the echoes of laughter and kinking glasses from speakeasies faded into distant memories. The Purity Distilling Company, once a beacon of promise amid the shadows of Prohibition, now stood at the precipice of ruin, its ambitions drowned in a sea of molasses, forever changing the landscape of Boston's North End. In the bitter January of 1919, the streets of Boston were lined with cobblestones slick from the recent snow, the chill biting through wool coats and knitted scarves. The air was thick with a mix of apprehension and excitement as the towering steel structure loomed over the old wharves. The massive molasses tank, a behemoth 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, stood proudly against the gray sky, its polished exterior gleaming ominously in the weak winter light. Local residents had gathered in small, murmuring clusters, their breath visible in the frigid air. They exchanged wary glances, their faces etched with concern. The tank, built to store molasses for the Boston Molasses Company's distilling process, had been the subject of heated debate since its construction began months earlier. Whispers of its structural integrity danced among the townsfolk. each recounting tales of engineering failures and the catastrophic consequences that often followed. "Did you hear what happened in California last summer?" a woman in a threadbare shawl said, her voice rising above the din. "That tank burst and molasses flooded the streets. It took weeks to clean up." Her companion, a balding man with a grizzled beard, nodded gravely. "Aye, and the company promises this one is safe. But can we trust them? Look at the size of it." He gestured toward the immense structure, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "What if it gives way? The weight of all that molasses, imagine the disaster." Despite their fears, the representatives of the Boston Molasses Company walked among the crowd, their faces bright with confidence. Clad in tailored suits and bowler hats, they projected a veneer of assurance that did little to quell the rising tide of anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them called out, his voice booming above the murmurs, "rest assured, this tank has been engineered with the utmost precision. It is built to withstand the harshest conditions, far beyond anything nature can throw at it." Yet the townsfolk remained skeptical, their hearts gripped by the specter of disaster. They cast wary glances at the imposing structure, imagining the consequences of a catastrophic failure. The winter wind howled, sending a shiver down their spines, as they envisioned a wave of thick, sticky molasses pouring into the streets, swallowing everything in its path. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber hue over the city, the men in suits continued their presentation, their words growing increasingly hollow to the anxious crowd. "We have the finest engineers working on this project. You have nothing to fear." But even as they spoke, the unease intensified. The townsfolk could feel the ground beneath their feet tremble with the weight of the tank, and with it, a sense of foreboding settled over them like a heavy fog. Meanwhile, workers toiled diligently, their hammers ringing in the air, echoes of progress mingling with the murmurs of doubt. As the last rivets were secured, the tank stood unyielding, a monument to industrial ambition. Yet, within the hearts of those who watched, a question lingered, unspoken but palpable. Could progress come without peril? With nightfall, the scene shifted. Shadows crept across the tank's surface, and the wind picked up, howling like a restless spirit. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, glancing back at the looming steel giant, each step heavy with a blend of hope and dread, the promise of prosperity intertwined with the fear of calamity. The molasses tank, a testament to modern engineering, had become the embodiment of their deepest anxieties, a precarious balance of dreams and nightmares. In the heart of Boston, the winter of 1919 descended with an unrelenting chill, yet the sidewalks of the North End were sticky with an unsettling warmth. The towering molasses tank, a remnant of the city's booming sugar industry, loomed over the narrow streets, a behemoth of rust and decay. For years, it had stood sentinel, its ominous presence overshadowed by the bustling life of the neighborhood. But this winter, the air was thick with a cloying sweetness, a scent that mingled with the crisp, cold air, heralding trouble. Residents began to notice the first signs of distress in the tank. What started as a mere trickle soon morphed into a steady seep, dark and viscous, pulling on the cobblestones like a sinister shadow. Children, oblivious to the warnings of their elders, delighted in the novelty of the sticky substance, their laughter echoing against the brick facades. But for the adults, the laughter quickly soured into apprehension. The molasses was more than a nuisance. It was a harbinger of disaster. As the days passed, the complaints grew louder. Mrs. DeLuca, whose small grocery stood just a stone's throw from the tank, was the first to voice her concerns. "It's attracting every rodent in the city," she exclaimed, her hands flailing in exasperation as she gestured toward the growing congregation of rats that skittered about, drawn by the sweet allure. Her voice rose above the clamor of the market, an urgent alarm amidst the mundane chatter of shoppers. The molasses not only sullied the streets, it conjured forth an army of unwelcome guests, their beady eyes glinting in the muted winter light. The odor, a pungent amalgamation of sweet decay, wafted through the neighborhood, seeping into homes like an unwelcome guest. Residents clutched their noses as they trudged past, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken fears. "What if it bursts?" whispered Mr. Sullivan, the local carpenter, his brow furrowed with worry. "That tank's been leaking for months. It can't hold out forever." The warning hung in the air, thickening the tension as residents grappled with the unthinkable. With each day, the community's unease festered. The Molasses crept further into the streets, and soon the very essence of the North End felt threatened. Petitions circulated, signatures scrawled in hurried scripts as neighbors rallied together, their voices rising in unison against the looming menace. "We must alert the city," they declared, eyes glinting with determination. But their urgency met the indifferent bureaucracy of city officials, who dismissed their fears as exaggerated. "It's just molasses," they said, brushing aside the potent warnings. Yet, as the tank continued its slow exodus of gooey liquid, the weight of complacency bore down on the community. As the month wore on, the air grew heavier, both with the scent of molasses and the tension of rising anxiety. Children no longer played in the streets, their laughter replaced by whispers of dread. The once thriving neighborhood was gripped by a sense of impending doom, each resident haunted by the thought that the dark, syrupy tide might soon unleash its wrath. On a fateful January afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, the tank shuddered ominously, a deep groan reverberating through the streets. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the burden it bore, and the tension snapped like a taut string. The sound echoed through the North End, a foreboding prelude to the chaos that would soon follow, leaving the community poised on the brink of calamity. The cold January air hung heavy over South Boston, sharp and biting against the skin of the workers, trudging toward the massive tank looming at the edge of the waterfront. It towered over the landscape, a rusting behemoth that loomed like a monstrous creature, its metal skin glinting dully in the pale winter sunlight. The tank, a testament to the booming industry of wartime, now stood filled with a volatile brew that had once been a symbol of progress but was now a source of mounting dread. Amid the bustling sounds of machinery and the shouts of foremen, whispers of concern rippled through the ranks of laborers. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging fearful glances as they described the strange noises emanating from the tank. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, growing louder with each passing day. Some claimed it was a warning, a harbinger of disaster. Others, more superstitious, likened it to the growl of a great beast, awoken from its slumber, restless and angry. Despite the palpable tension in the air, the management of the American Sugar Refining Company remained dismissive. The clang of iron and the hiss of steam drowned out the workers' concerns, the clatter of productivity overshadowing their fears. "Get back to work," barked Mr. Hargrove, the foreman, his voice cutting through the cold like a knife. "Those are just the sounds of progress, not your imaginations running wild." He waved a hand dismissively, his focus solely on the company's bottom line. Yet the noises grew louder, a cacophony that echoed through the narrow streets, reverberating in the bones of the men and women who toiled nearby. Each day, the tension mounted, threads of anxiety woven tightly into the fabric of the community. Mothers hushed their children, warning them to stay away from the tank, while fathers shared stories of past disasters, their faces lined with worry. On the morning of January 15th, the sun peeked timidly through the fog that clung to Boston, illuminating the tank with an eerie glow. The air was still, but the uneasy atmosphere thickened, pregnant with the sense of impending doom. Workers gathered in small groups, their faces pale, as they shared a collective unease. "We must tell someone," said Samuel, a stout man with a furrowed brow. "If the tank is to burst, we will not be able to save ourselves." But the warnings went unheeded. The company, driven by the insatiable demand for sugar, pressed on, ignoring the pleas of the workers. The rumbling continued to rise, a menacing growl that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the city. The days passed, the foreman's orders ringing hollow against the backdrop of dread. Then, on the fateful morning of January 18th, the beast finally awoke, a thunderous roar erupted from the tank, drowning out the cries of terror. The earth trembled beneath the weight of the explosion, a blinding flash of fire and chaos consuming the air. In that moment, the warnings that had been so carelessly dismissed transformed into a nightmare, and the consequences of negligence spilled forth, forever altering the lives of those in South Boston. Smoke and debris filled the sky, shrouding the city in a dank veil. The rumbling beast had unleashed its fury, a tragic reminder of the price of ignored warnings and the perils of prioritizing production over safety. The sun hung low over Boston on January 14, 1919, casting an unusual warmth over the city that had long been gripped by the chill of winter. The air, once crisp and biting, now carried a hint of spring, inviting the citizens to shed their heavy coats and venture into the streets. Children played in the slush that formed from melting snow, their laughter echoing through the cobblestone alleys. As the afternoon wore on, an ominous stillness enveloped the North End, where the towering molasses tank of the Purity Distilling Company loomed over the neighborhood like a dormant giant. Inside the tank, a viscous sea of molasses swirled restlessly. The temperature had risen, and the sweet syrup began to expand, pressing against the walls of the massive structure. The tank, built in 1915, was already a source of concern among the locals, with whispers of its shoddy construction echoing through taverns and marketplaces. Yet despite the unease, the sweet scent of molasses wafted through the air, as familiar to the residents as the salt of the harbor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, a low rumble began to reverberate within the tank. Foreman John McGowan, a stout man with a bushy mustache, had been monitoring the tank's pressure throughout the day. He furrowed his brow, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the unseasonable chill. The pressure gauge danced dangerously close to the red line, but he dismissed the thought, reassuring himself that the tank had withstood worse conditions. If only he had listened to the warnings of his workers, who had begged him to take precautions, but McGowan had shrugged off their fears, intent on meeting quotas. As night fell, the streets began to empty, the soft glow of gas lamps illuminating the path for late-night stragglers. A lone horse-drawn cart clattered over the cobblestones, its driver unaware of the peril that simmered just a stone's throw away. The air grew thick with an unsettling tension, a warm spell transforming into a stifling heat as the molasses reached its boiling point. Then, just after 7 p.m., the world erupted. A thunderous roar shattered the stillness, a sound reminiscent of cannon fire. The tank, unable to contain the pressure, burst forth with a ferocious force, sending a wave of molasses cascading through the streets. The sticky tide surged like a monstrous beast unleashed, devouring everything in its path: the cart, the lampposts, and the very cobblestones that had borne witness to generations of life. Screams echoed through the night as the sweet, dark liquid engulfed homes and businesses, dragging people into its suffocating embrace. The molasses, thick and treacherous, clung to the terrified residents who struggled against its pull. Panic ensued, and in that harrowing moment, the North End transformed into a scene of chaos and despair, a nightmare that would be etched in the memories of Bostonians for years to come. As the disaster unfolded, the warm spell that had felt so comforting just hours before turned into a haunting reminder of nature's unpredictability, forever altering the landscape of this bustling neighborhood and sealing the fate of many in a tide of molasses. On January 15, 1919, at precisely 12:30 p.m., an ominous rumble reverberated through the North End of Boston, a sound reminiscent of distant thunder. But this was no storm brewing on the horizon. It was the foreboding herald of disaster. The great molasses tank, a colossal structure looming over the neighborhood, could no longer withstand the pressure of its viscous contents. In an instant, the tank's iron rivets screamed in protest before bursting asunder, releasing a monstrous wave of molasses that surged forth with the fury of an unleashed beast. The tidal wave, measuring over 25 feet high, crashed through the narrow streets of Commercial and Commercial Wharf, bearing down on the unsuspecting populace. Countless pedestrians, engaged in their daily routines, were caught unawares as the wave of thick brown syrup cascaded down like a chocolate flood. In mere moments, the bustling thoroughfare was transformed into a nightmarish scene of chaos and confusion. The Molasses, moving at a staggering speed of 35 miles per hour, enveloped everything in its path. Horse-drawn carriages toppled over, their occupants struggling to escape as the sticky substance clung to them like the grip of a predator. A baker and his assistant, busy at work in a nearby shop, were thrown from their feet, their freshly baked loaves swallowed by the sticky deluge. The air, once filled with the scent of bread and the chatter of neighbors, was now heavy with the cloying odor of molasses, a sweetness turned sour by panic. As buildings trembled and crumbled under the weight of the onslaught, a mother clasped her child tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The wave surged into her home, shattering windows and dragging furniture into its viscous embrace, weaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The streets, once vibrant with life, now resembled a battlefield, littered with debris and the cries of those caught in the molasses tide. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, though they were hampered by the very nature of the disaster. Firefighters, their faces set with grim determination, waded into the gooey depths, struggling to reach those trapped beneath the syrupy mass. Their boots sank into the thick substance, each step an arduous battle against the sticky grip that sought to hold them back. A man in a woolen coat, his features distorted by fear, shouted for help as he clung to a lamppost, his arms coated in the suffocating brown. Within moments, the streets became a quagmire of despair. Horses, once symbols of strength and reliability, struggled in vain against the molasses, their hooves mired in the thick syrup. Rescuers, their hearts pounding with urgency, formed human chains, reaching into the depths of the sticky flood to pull survivors from the wreckage. Their efforts were met with both triumph and heartache as they fought against the relentless tide. As the chaos ensued, the sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long shadows over the scene of devastation. The aftermath of the catastrophe would linger long after the molasses had receded, leaving behind a city marked by loss and sorrow. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 would become a chilling reminder of nature's unpredictable wrath, forever etched into the history of Boston, a tale of sweetness turned to tragedy. The air hung heavy with an unusual sweetness as the ground trembled beneath the weight of catastrophe. On January 15, 1919, the sun rose over Boston, casting a pallid light that struggled to penetrate the dense fog rolling off the harbor. A sudden roar erupted from the north end, a sound that could only be likened to that of thunder, a harbinger of doom that reverberated through the narrow streets and into the hearts of the unsuspecting residents. Moments later, a tsunami of thick, viscous molasses surged forth from the ruptured tank of the Purity Distilling Company. The substance, once a mundane ingredient in kitchens across the city, transformed into a monstrous wave, engulfing everything in its path. Homes, storefronts, and unsuspecting pedestrians alike were swallowed whole, their cries muffled by the sticky deluge that spread like wildfire through the streets. The molasses, a deep, rich brown, glistened ominously under the waning winter light, suffocating all it touched. It slithered through alleyways, creeping up the legs of lampposts and lapping at the doors of frightened citizens. The once bustling thoroughfare transformed into a surreal landscape where the familiar sights of Boston were obscured by a shroud of syrupy despair. In the midst of the chaos, the cries of the trapped echoed, mingling with the shouts of those who rushed to help. First responders, clad in heavy wool uniforms, battled against the thick molasses that clung to their boots like a relentless predator. With each step, they struggled to advance, their movements slowed by the very substance they sought to conquer. They stumbled over debris, wooden beams, broken glass, and the remnants of lives interrupted, each obstacle a reminder of the fragility of human existence. As the rescue efforts unfolded, volunteers emerged from the shadows. Drawn by the desperate pleas for assistance, neighbors, moved by instinct and compassion, joined the fray, wielding ropes and makeshift tools in a valiant attempt to pull the trapped from their sticky tombs. They worked feverishly, yet the molasses, thick as treacle, held its captives fast. The very air was heavy with the scent of sugar and despair, a bitter reminder of the lives lost in the struggle for survival. Among the crowd, a woman named Mary O'Connell knelt against a lamppost, her heart racing as she scanned the chaos for any sign of her husband, Thomas. The dread that gripped her was palpable. Men and women alike were swept away in the tide of sweet destruction. She clutched a small rosary, whispering prayers under her breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for the familiar warmth of his hand. As the hours ticked by, the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the devastation. Rescuers, faces grimy and weary, continued their harrowing work. They pulled at limbs caught in debris, their hands sticky and slick, but their resolve unyielding. The cries for help began to wane, replaced by the somber realization of loss. The toll of the Molasses flood would forever mark the city and its people. In the aftermath, the streets, once filled with the laughter of children and the hum of daily life, lay silent. A bitter reminder of the day when sweetness turned to sorrow, forever altering the fabric of the community. As night fell, the remnants of the disaster glistened under the pale moonlight, a haunting tableau of human tragedy and resilience amid the chaos. As the frigid January winds swept through the streets of Boston, a grim pall hung over the city, a testament to the recent disaster that had shaken the very foundations of its resilient spirit. The date was January 16, 1919, and the aftermath of the catastrophic Molasses flood, which had unleashed a deadly wave of viscous syrup, still lay thick in the air. The clamorous echoes of the tragedy reverberated through the narrow alleys and bustling neighborhoods, where the scent of molasses clung heavily to the remnants of shattered lives. In the days following the disaster, a surge of community spirit enveloped the city. The people of Boston, their faces drawn and weary, gathered in makeshift meeting halls and street corners, united by a deep, unyielding resolve. Men and women, young and old, donned their heavy coats and hats, their breath visible in the cold, as they formed committees to coordinate rescue efforts. The news of lives lost and families shattered spurred them into action, igniting a fierce determination that coursed through the veins of the city like the very syrup that had caused such devastation. By the morning of January 17th, the air was filled with the sounds of hammers and the shouts of volunteers rallying together. Local carpenters and laborers, with their hands roughened by toil, constructed makeshift barriers and supports to stabilize the buildings at risk of collapse. The streets, once lined with bustling markets and lively chatter, now bore the somber weight of grief and urgency. As volunteers toiled, the heavy scent of molasses lingered, a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded just days prior. Throughout the city, neighbors rose to help one another. Families prepared pots of steaming stew, their kitchens filled with the warmth of simmering broth, which they ladled into bowls for those whose homes had been swept away. Children, their small hands eager to assist, scurried about collecting clothes, blankets, and other necessities for the displaced. The sense of camaraderie was palpable. Despite the chilling temperatures, the warmth of human kindness shone brightly. On January 18th, a group of young men, emboldened by the spirit of heroism, ventured into the heart of the devastation, where the remnants of the collapsed structures lay entangled in a sticky embrace of molasses. With each careful step, they navigated the wreckage, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The cries of those still trapped echoed around them, mingling with the sound of their boots squelching in the thick syrup. They worked tirelessly, digging through the debris, calling out names in hopes of hearing a response that would signal life amidst the ruins. As the days unfolded, the Boston community continued to rally together, holding candlelight vigils for the missing and the deceased. The flickering flames illuminated the faces of sorrowful residents, their expressions a blend of mourning and solidarity. They gathered at the corners of streets, hands clasped in unity, sharing stories of those who had been lost, honoring their memories with every whispered name. The flickering light became a beacon of hope, illuminating the darkened corners of their hearts, reminding them of the strength found in togetherness. By January 20th, the enormity of the disaster remained, but so too did the indomitable spirit of the Boston community. In the face of overwhelming loss, they had forged a bond that would endure, a testament to the resilience that had defined their city for generations. As they looked toward the future, the people of Boston understood that while the scars of January 1919 would never fully fade, the lessons learned in tragedy would knit them closer together, forever altering the fabric of their city. As the bitter winds of January swept through the streets of Boston, the atmosphere crackled with tension and disbelief. A sense of urgency hung in the air, like the remnants of soot from the recent disaster that had claimed lives, homes, and the very spirit of the community. The Purity Distilling Company, once a proud emblem of industry and progress, now stood at the center of a swirling storm of scrutiny and outrage. Just days after the catastrophic explosion that had rocked the North End, leaving a gaping wound in the fabric of the neighborhood, city officials convened in hastily organized meetings. The scent of burnt wood and spilled spirits still lingered, a pungent reminder of the calamity that had unfolded. The once bustling streets, now lined with debris and the remnants of shattered lives, served as a grim backdrop for the inquiry that was about to unfold. Investigators, their faces etched with determination, sifted through the wreckage of the distillery. A cacophony of voices filled the air as they gathered testimony from survivors, shopkeepers, and the dazed residents who had witnessed the horrors of that fateful day. Eyewitness accounts, punctuated by the tremors of grief and anger, painted a grim picture of negligence. Whispers of ominous premonitions echoed through the crowd, warnings issued to the company about the integrity of the towering storage tanks that had ruptured. "Did you see the cracks?" An older man, his voice gravelly with age, recounted to a cluster of reporters. It was as if they were begging to be noticed, but nobody wanted to listen. The company's greed drowned out our concerns. As the investigation progressed, the focus sharpened on the very design and construction of the storage tanks. The engineers had employed a flawed design, one that had been hastily approved amidst a rush to capitalize on the booming demand for alcohol following the end of the Great War. The blueprints, once the pride of the firm, now lay exposed to the harsh light of inquiry, revealing corners cut and safety precautions overlooked. With each passing day, the tension escalated. The city's council convened, and as politicians and business leaders gathered, the air thickened with accusations and blame. The Purity Distilling Company, which had once enjoyed the favor of the public, now found itself under siege. The mayor, his brow furrowed in deep concern, questioned the company's president, a man whose demeanor had shifted from prideful to defensive in the face of mounting evidence. "The safety of our community has been compromised," the mayor declared, his voice resonating with authority. "We cannot allow such negligence to go unpunished. How many lives must be sacrificed for the sake of profit?" Outside the council chamber, a crowd had gathered, families of the victims, their faces drawn and hollow, clutching photographs of loved ones lost in the disaster. The air was thick with sorrow and rage, a volatile mix igniting the hearts of the bereaved. "Justice," they cried, their voices rising above the din of the city, calling for accountability in a world that seemed determined to turn a blind eye. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the consequences of negligence would not be easily swept aside. With each revelation, the city grappled with the weight of its own complicity in the industrial age, a time when progress often came at the cost of human life. The Purity Distilling Company, once a bastion of growth, now stood as a stark reminder of the fragility of safety amid unbridled ambition. The cold January winds continued to blow, carrying with them the resolve of a city determined to seek justice amidst the wreckage. The air in Boston was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and despair as April 1919 unfolded. The city, still reeling from the horrors of the Great War, now found itself embroiled in a different yet equally fierce battle. Families of the victims of the Purity Distilling Company disaster began to gather in the shadow of the courthouse, their faces a tapestry of grief and determination. The clamor of voices, punctuated by the sharp click of heels against cobblestones, filled the streets, echoing the urgency of their cause. Within the cavernous courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The mahogany benches bore witness to a somber procession of mothers, fathers, and children, each clutching faded photographs of the loved ones lost in the tragic explosion. The flickering gas lamps cast long shadows, illuminating the pained expressions of the plaintiffs as they awaited their moment to speak. Outside, the press thronged, eager to capture the unfolding drama. Reporters scribbled hastily, their pencils scratching out the story that would soon grip the nation. As the proceedings commenced, the judge, an austere figure clad in black robes, called the court to order. The Purity Distilling Company's legal representatives, a cadre of smooth-talking attorneys, oozed confidence as they strode to the front. Their suits were impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the ragged clothing worn by those who had come to seek justice. With practiced ease, they dismissed the family's suffering as mere collateral damage in the pursuit of progress. The words "unforeseeable accident" dripped from their lips like poison, igniting a firestorm of outrage among the assembled crowd. A mother, her face pale and drawn, rose to testify. Her voice trembled as she recounted the day the tank had burst, an unholy roar that shattered the peace of their neighborhood and took her son in an instant. The courtroom held its breath as she spoke of the day-to-day life before the tragedy. The laughter, the warmth of a shared meal, the promise of tomorrow that was so cruelly snatched away. Her words hung heavy in the air, weaving a narrative of loss that resonated deeply with those present. As the testimonies mounted, so too did the revelations. It was revealed that the distilling company had long neglected the maintenance of its facilities, a fact that had been buried beneath layers of corporate greed. Witnesses spoke of rusted tanks and inadequate safety measures, painting a grim picture of negligence that had led to the catastrophic explosion. The public, once apathetic to the workings of industry, now stirred with indignation. Whispers of accountability rippled through the crowd. The moral fabric of the city was being tested. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of protesters gathered, brandishing placards that read, "Justice for the innocent" and "Accountability now." The palpable anger mingled with sorrow as they rallied for the families, their chants echoing in the cool spring air. The media, sensing a turning tide, thrummed with excitement. A narrative of corporate malfeasance was unfolding, one that would not be easily ignored. As the day wore on, the court's proceedings revealed the stark contrast between the lives of the grieving families and the interests of the Purity Distilling Company. The gavel struck, signaling a brief recess, but the battle was far from over. The legal battles that had begun would extend into the hallways of power and public opinion, igniting a movement that would challenge the very foundations of industry in a city that had once turned a blind eye to its own suffering. The fight for justice had only just begun, and the resolve of these families would not be easily extinguished. The courtroom was a battleground of emotions, a cauldron of tension simmering beneath the surface as the gavel struck with a resounding thud. Dust motes danced in the harsh afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, illuminating the faces of the gathered crowd, a mosaic of hope, despair, and determination. It was the year 1925, but the shadows of the disaster that had claimed so many lives in 1919 loomed large, casting a pall over the proceedings. At the center of it all stood the Purity Distilling Company, a once revered titan of industry, now roiling under the weight of public scrutiny. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and stale tobacco, mingling with the anxious whispers of the families who had lost loved ones in the tragic explosion that had rocked the city 6 years prior. They sat huddled together, fingers intertwined, their eyes darting from the judge to the jury, seeking any flicker of justice. The lead attorney for the plaintiffs, a stout man named Edgar Thompson, rose to his feet, his voice steady yet imbued with an undercurrent of urgency. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge with a deep reverence, "the evidence we have presented substantiates a gross neglect of safety protocols by the Purity Distilling Company. The explosion that obliterated the East Boston neighborhood was not merely an unfortunate accident. It was a preventable tragedy born from the greed of a corporation that placed profit above the lives of its workers and neighbors." As he spoke, the families leaned forward, hearts pounding, breath caught in their throats. The memories of that fateful day came rushing back. The roar of flames, the anguished cries, the acrid smoke that choked the city. The fire had consumed not just structures but lives, mothers, fathers, children, all reduced to ashes and despair. Across the aisle, the defense attorney, a tall, gaunt figure named William Hargrove, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, his voice a calculated blend of cool detachment and practiced persuasion. "Your Honor," he countered, "this disaster was an unfortunate confluence of circumstances. To hold the Purity Distilling Company accountable is to impose a burden that will stifle the very industry that drives our economy forward. Our nation is built on the backbone of enterprise, and we must not allow fear to compromise innovation." The tension in the room crackled like electricity, a palpable energy that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the city. The judge, a stern figure with a mane of white hair, surveyed the courtroom with piercing eyes, weighing the implications of the decision that rested on his shoulders. Outside, the city of Boston thrummed with its own rhythm, unaware of the monumental shift that was about to unfold within these walls. As the deliberations continued, whispers of hope began to ripple through the crowd. They were not merely seeking restitution, they were demanding accountability, a reckoning that would echo through the annals of industrial history. The families, once silenced by grief, now found their voices united in purpose, a chorus of resolve resonating against the backdrop of a city that had witnessed their suffering. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge returned to the bench, his gavel poised to strike once more. The room held its breath, a collective pause pregnant with anticipation. The ruling would not only define the fate of the Purity Distilling Company, but would also set a precedent that would reshape the very fabric of industrial safety regulations in the years to come. In that moment, the echoes of the past became the foundation for a future where accountability would reign. And the lives lost would not be forgotten. The gavel fell, and with it, the course of history began to shift, one deliberate judgment at a time. The sun dipped low over Boston on the afternoon of January 15, 1919, casting a golden hue across the North End, where the briny scent of the harbor mingled with the chill of the winter air. The streets bustled with life, yet an unsettling tension shimmered just beneath the surface of the day. In the heart of the neighborhood stood the towering, hulking structure of the Purity Distilling Company, its iron facade looming like a dark sentry. Inside, the vast storage tank, an immense 50-foot behemoth, waited, filled to the brim with over 2 million gallons of molasses, a sweet elixir destined for fermentation. As the clock struck 12, the rhythm of the city shifted. A low rumble echoed through the cobbled streets, a sound that would soon transform into a cacophony of destruction. Workers slushing through the molasses-slicked alleyways paused, their laughter stifled, eyes wide as they felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. Unbeknownst to them, the tank, long considered a marvel of modern industry, was succumbing to a fatal flaw. Its rivets, corroded and weakened by the sticky substance they contained, could no longer withstand the pressure. At 12:30 p.m., the world erupted in chaos. With a deafening roar, the tank burst, unleashing a colossal wave of molasses that surged forth, a dark tsunami crashing down upon the unsuspecting neighborhood. It swept through the streets with ferocity, engulfing everything in its path, shops, homes, and the lives of those who called the North End their own. The sticky flood glistened menacingly in the midday sun, a treacherous brown tide that swallowed horses and men alike, their cries muffled beneath the viscous deluge. In the aftermath, the scene was one of utter devastation. The molasses, thick and unyielding, clung to everything it touched, transforming the familiar landscape into a nightmarish tableau. Rescuers waded through the remnants of the flood, their boots sinking into the viscous goo, desperately searching for the trapped and injured. The air was heavy with the sweet, cloying odor of molasses, a stark contrast to the cries of the wounded and the panicked shouts of those trying to save them. As the hours wore on, the full weight of the tragedy began to settle upon the shoulders of the city. 21 souls were lost, their lives claimed by negligence and the unpredictable wrath of nature. In the days that followed, the streets of Boston bore witness to grief, anger, and the gnawing feeling of betrayal. Questions erupted like the floodwaters themselves. How could this have happened? How had the authorities allowed such a glaring oversight to persist within the city's industrial heart? The legacy of the molasses flood would reverberate far beyond that fateful winter day. In the wake of the disaster, a wave of scrutiny swept through Boston's industrial sector, kindling a fervent demand for stricter regulations and oversight of manufacturing facilities. Citizens rallied, their voices rising in unison against the negligence that had led to such a catastrophe. The city, once vibrant with the hum of industry, now carried a solemn reminder of the tenuous balance between progress and peril. Years later, as the Molasses settled into the annals of local lore, the flood would be recounted as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of safety amidst the march of innovation. The scent of molasses lingered in the air long after the flood receded, a sweet memory tinged with sorrow, a testament to the power of nature and the enduring scars of human folly.